This screencast is going to pick up with Pontiac's Rebellion. This is going to be an event that happens immediately following the French and Indian War. Native Americans were particularly upset that the British had won the war. You know, if you recall, most of them had allied themselves with the French during the war, and they very much feared the desires and plans of the land-greedy British. There's a lot more British settlers than French, so they always posed a bigger threat to them. So Native American Chief Pontiac will gather multiple tribes, a multi-tribal forces from different groups within the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes region. Basically just different natives who wish to keep British settlers east and out of their region. When he collects these forces, a dozen settler communities or more, a dozen British settler communities and forts were attacked by this Native American group. And initially, Pontiac was actually very successful in these attacks. His forces were able to capture most of the British forts that were attacked. But eventually, the natives would have a shortage of food and ammunition, and many of them become sick and suffer with smallpox. In part, actually, smallpox spread in this case due to the British troops intentionally trading smallpox-infected blankets within this rebellion. So that was kind of a very, it's an example of like health warfare or medical warfare, I guess. But eventually, by 1766, the natives are completely defeated. King George does try to accommodate the natives' demands by issuing something called the Proclamation of 1763. This is his way of trying to kind of compromise with Native Americans. This proclamation will prohibit almost all British colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. So, if you know where the Appalachian Mountains are, kind of like looking at this map here, you can kind of really just imagine like the line where the original 13 colonies stop, like where the dark red becomes the pink. The mountain range is kind of what divided that region. So that is saying that the colonists are not going to be allowed to settle west of that line into all this new territory they just won in the war. So many colonists are going to refuse to obey the proclamation. They're going to move west anyway. It's kind of hard to enforce from the king's perspective. But this whole process is a bit frustrating for British colonists who just won all this land by fighting in the French and Indian War themselves. Because recall that they're the ones who actually fought in the war. Just to point out the fact, too, I mentioned King George III. He's the British monarch at this time. You want to know his name, okay? He was the monarch who made this proclamation line. Okay. French resettlement. The French and Indian War did displace tens and thousands of people. Not all of the people displaced are forced out. A lot of people choose to leave and relocate on their own behalf, but nonetheless, tens of thousands would be displaced. Some French would go back to France. Others would resettle in the Caribbean, and some would eventually go to Louisiana, and that's where we get, of course, our own Cajun culture from. So, when the British troops stormed Nova Scotia, which is a region in Canada, northeastern Canada, they aim at securing this region by deporting all of the people living there, called the Acadians. Deporting meaning forced out. The British fear the Acadians because they are French, they are Catholic. They don't really think they can be trusted to be left in this region. And it's kind of, the war was still happening at the time they stormed Nova Scotia, so they want to secure Canada at all costs. The expelling of the Acadians was a very violent process. The British would torch their homes, torch their fields. They would forcibly remove about 7,000 of them within the year of landing in Nova Scotia. And they would be brought into the British colonies where they were expected to assimilate, meaning kind of morph and identify with the rest of the British society. And many will instead choose to resettle back in France or a French colony. And that's how many of them will actually eventually make it to Louisiana. Basically, the French will first travel to the Caribbean, to the French-controlled Caribbean island of Saint-Domingue. And they would be here for some time, but eventually many of those settlers would leave for Louisiana, which was actually still under French control at this point for a few more years because the war hadn't actually, and the treaty hadn't actually ended yet or been signed yet. So they, right now, all these people are still looking at Louisiana as a French-controlled territory. So again, your first option was to resettle in the British colonies. They didn't really want to do that, so many of them chose to head to Saint-Domingue, where they would eventually instead wind up settling in the French-controlled Louisiana. It's here they begin calling themselves Cajuns, which is kind of a derivative off of Acadian, Cajun. Just a quick note, if you're familiar with Henry Longfellow's poem Evangeline, this talks about the grand dérangement, the mass expulsion and relocation of all of the Acadians coming out of Nova Scotia and coming back into Louisiana. It's a Louisiana it's Louisiana folklore. We don't really think there's actually someone specifically named Evangeline, but if you're familiar with the story of her waiting for her long-lost love that she was separated from in this process, Gabriel, at the oak tree, and I believe in St. Martinville, Louisiana, there's actually a oak tree called the Evangeline Oak with a statue there commemorating her. And it's a very sad poem, actually. It kind of highlights the emotional side of that forced relocation of the Acadians out of Canada, because that was their home. Alright, and we're going to end today talking about the costs of war. And this is kind of going to transition us into the effects of the French and Indian War on the colonies. England will find itself in a large amount of debt following the war. War is expensive, as always. They need to raise money, so what is one way to do this? And the answer there is to raise taxes. So they're going to raise taxes in England, but eventually this will transfer to the colonies as well. So what happens is a new prime minister is established, and his name is George Grenville. You see him pictured. You see his name spelled if you need his name spelled. I think I might have it on your outline, though. When Grenville becomes the new prime minister, he's going to be making some pretty big changes. He wants to lower the domestic tax burden in England, because at home in England and London they're getting taxed. And he wants to do this by raising revenue from within the colonies. Keep in mind that some of the money that England is going to be trying to raise is going to be used to maintain and keep up the British colonies in North America. So it's not like the money wouldn't be seen in the colonies as well. Part of England's expenditures and budget involves maintaining their control of these colonies, so and protecting them. So that's one thing to think about. Now recall that the Navigation Acts were also supposed to be doing this. All those laws that are having certain items being taxed and certain items being sent directly to England. Certain items not allowed to be sold in the colonies. All of those things are supposed to be increasing the revenue for Great Britain. But the colonies were rarely following those rules. Recall what salutary neglect is, and the fact that they were kind of getting away with just being left alone and doing what they wanted and smuggling behind Britain's back. So Grenville's in charge now, though, and he has plans and plans to change things. So he is going to pass a piece of legislation through Parliament called the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act was a very clever piece of legislation. It increased the import tax on certain goods while lowering the import tax on others, in hopes that the colonists would be more willing to pay, and be more willing to pay the tax. At the same time, it increased the penalty for not paying the tax. So if you were guilty of smuggling, and if you were caught smuggling, there would be much harsher punishments. So the colonists aren't going to be allowed to get away with as much smuggling as they had been doing prior to this. But recall that they weren't used to paying this anyway. So this is going to be a change, even though Grenville's trying to make it somewhat of a compromise by lowering some. They weren't paying any taxes to begin with, so now they're just going to be in a bad spot. The Sugar Act actually increases taxes not only on sugar, but also coffee, silk, animal hides, amongst other things. And to increase the penalty of those caught smuggling, Grenville established a new court within the colonies that would seize any ships caught smuggling goods between British America, the British American colonies, and the French West Indies, which is where they're smuggling a lot of their stuff from, like sugar. Grenville believes profoundly in imperial sovereignty. He thinks England has the complete authority to do this. He doesn't think that the colonists have any right to challenge any sort of rule or declaration coming out of Parliament. Some colonial elected assemblies, however, will protest this act on the basis that they had not been allowed to vote for taxes imposed on them by Parliament. This is very small scale right now, but that should kind of sound familiar, with the colonists kind of opposing the idea that, well, we shouldn't have to pay this tax because we didn't get to vote on this in Parliament. It's a pretty famous battle cry. No taxation without representation. This is going to grow into that long term. We're not quite there just yet, but you do see a few people bringing the point up that, hey, we didn't get to vote on this. There's no one representing our interests in Parliament. How come y'all can pass taxes on us that we have to do this? But all in all, many will just start paying the tax, but this is just one of many laws that Grenville and his legacy is going to start kind of passing out of Parliament that the colonists are going to be a little riled up about. So just kind of to be continued. The last little note here is the Whigs. Whigs refer to Americans who oppose British taxes during this kind of imperial crisis. They begin referring to themselves as the Whigs. It was actually a political party in England that stood against the excessive centralized parliament and royal power. They didn't want like an increased over-regulating federal government and imperial monarch. So this group is very inspired by the Enlightenment, like living in the American colonies. Examples of people that would come out of this group are people like Ben Franklin and several other prominent names, but he's just one example. But these men, these Whigs, will eventually become the leaders of the colonial resistance to Britain. And that's kind of just a good little wrap-up note, an idea before we will finish Chapter 6 on Monday. So please write down any questions you have, if any of this was confusing, and I look forward to seeing you all on Monday. Have a good day and a good weekend.